up from Fort Erie. They took the town of Fort Erie. They burned down a railway bridge. They cut the telegraph lines that were going out, at least. And they had a few hours to get as many men and supplies over as they could before the paddle steamer was fixed and the U.S. Navy started patrolling the river, and they were cut off at night. So that night, they did a march, kind of a circular movement, to just north of the town of Ridgeway, which is now part of Fort Erie. And they kind of scouted out that location ahead of time. And they sat there and they waited for the Canadian militia who came along. The Canadian militia was supposed to wait for the British regulars. The Canadian officers, who were kind of just wealthy people who did this as a social thing, decided they wanted some glory. So they sent their very inexperienced men in, and they clashed with the very experienced Fenians. And we're actually doing pretty well until they saw some guys on horseback who were maybe scouts, maybe just locals coming to see what was happening, and they panicked and thought they were Fenian cavalry. So they formed a square, which is what the British do to defend against cavalry. And that means they're all concentrated in a very tightly packed formation, which allowed the Fenians to just pour in lead on them. And they eventually fled. But the Fenians, despite winning that and the later skirmish in Fort Erie, were thwarted by the U.S. Navy because they couldn't get any more troops or supplies across, and they were all arrested as they crossed back into the U.S. So yeah, if afterwards, if you'd like more information, I've got a map of the Ridgeway battlefield. I can actually show you how the troop movements played out over in the front there. That's it.
Here, a typical volunteer company from these areas during the Fenian Raid period. Basically just like infantry of the line, British Empire, or the gentleman on the far right is in the dark Lincoln green, which was standard color for the light companies or the rifle companies in the British Army. If there was any Royal Artillery here, they would have been in the dark blue, like the navy blue, and that was also British for hundreds of years. But we're carrying basically the same musket, rifled musket that the Fenians are carrying today. Imported thousands of these. This is a standard rifle that was issued throughout the British Empire. 1 year after 1866, as it got into the later 1867, right up to 1900, we got one later. So we converted these muzzle-loading muskets. We fired one round, concussion cap, to a rolling block, single-shot musket that fired eventually a proper brass bullet, same 58 caliber. So it was like an elephant gun. Like millions of these all around the world that were obsolete. So they didn't know what to do with them, so they put a breech pattern on it, and then in 1867 we got something like 20,000 of them shipped to Canada, Quebec, Ontario, and into the Maritimes. So when you see us in the field today, you're going to see that we're going to be loading firing the same as the Fenians on the other side of the field. So technologically, we're similar. Fenians most of them were American Civil War veterans of Irish background, whereas in these local parts, we're not. More from the English stock in these areas. Concept was that the Fenians would come up and we're going to take Canada hostage in retaliation to Great Britain, some so-called atrocities that they had done in Ireland. Bulk of the Irish people in Canada were in Lower Quebec, in that area, some in pockets of Ontario. They liked what they had here, so that portion of the Fenian invasions failed and whatnot. Regardless, what you're going to see today is a small microcosm of what like a Fenian raid may have looked like. Their uniforms a lot of them were surplus American Civil War uniforms, mostly blue and the federal, whatnot. These were government issued uniforms that your volunteer infantry companies would wear in these areas and whatnot. So there would have been a drill shed, probably the closest one around here, we thought was probably Aurelia. If you had Aurelia, you would have a volunteer company there. What the Fenian Raids did was they basically spurred the independent colonies of Canada to become country of Canada and provinces properly, because we needed to realize that Americans, although this was not an actual American army coming up, it was a private sort of an affair, but if they made a good foothold in here, there was a very good chance Washington may have just followed through.
Wow.
So we had to defend ourselves. After the Fenian Raids, independent companies like this were formed into proper battalions. So you had like the 35th, which eventually are still in existence today. Simcoe Foresters in Barrie and Owen Sound, modern Canadian Reserve unit, is still going. They formed in 1866, 1867. So all your little independent volunteer companies now were formed as a battalion. So what you're seeing here is some of us have number 12. This was 12th York Battalion. South of here, 5th Company Newmarket, for instance. And then we have some here that are 35th Battalion, that were further north in the Muskokas. So these would have been proper, actual formed battalions, so that if something like this happened again, you don't have independent companies all trying to get organized and find the train. You can tell you would have all converged in one specific place, and then you could go and you could fight the enemy just like they do today. So, any questions? What were you looking at? Good?
Rifleman, Coach Beckett. Five. Right about. Hey. Advance, arm. One, in single rank, right, base.
They have a hollowed out skirt underneath, and they would put like a little bit at the factory, they would put a little bit of pipe clay in there, and that would be sitting in the bottom. So the infantrymen would tether around, they wouldn't bite them, just pour the powder in, and then the ball would get shoved down. It would come right through the paper. And the ball had a wax tallow type of a coating on it. These are 5.77 caliber. The ball would be 5.70 or 5.75, a few thousandths of an inch smaller, because we don't want to struggle getting it down. So it would just slide down, especially if the thing's been fired a couple of times. It would melt a little and slide. Then the next thing would be the rammer would come out, and you would seat it real quick. Put the rammer back in, down, pull the hammer back. This is the percussion cap. This is the little cap with the nitrate in it. It goes on the nipple here. Sets the powder charge off. Then the mini ball goes downfield towards the target. So a good infantryman can do this 3 times a minute. Load. And by the orders of the corporal, fire. Back down. Load. Ram. Up. Prime. Fire. Everybody beside you gets hit, falls down, one in the back comes right up and you don't stop. Just go. That's your training. We're militia, so he's a dentist, he's a barber, he's a mechanic. This guy works with horses, he's a farrier, I'm a carpenter. This is what you did for a real living. This is what we did part-time. You would train a few times through the winter months. Summertime, it's busy. I think once a year, after the Fenian Raids, your militia would go down to Niagara on the lake in their battalions, like I was talking about before, and would be there for 2 weeks, learning full-time soldier stuff. So when you came back home, you would have the knowledge, and then you would continue that periodically throughout the year and whatnot. Yeah.
How many days did the battle last?
Fenian Raids?
Yeah.
A few hours.
Hours.
One of the biggest ones was down at Ridgeway, where it was off and on throughout the day. It was in a couple of different areas, but the Fenians attacked with, I think, up to 1,200.
But there were 5 invasions from 1866 to 1871. In 1871, I'm from Muskoka. There was a fellow by the name of Hardcastle Johnson who built the locks at Port Carling. And he was still so afraid of the Fenians that they built a rock fort on top of the hill in Port Carling, which is still there today to protect the locks there from the Fenians. You can see that today behind the real estate office. Even then, they were afraid of Muskoka.
Is that by the museum?
Well, just down the road, up behind the real estate office there, Regiments. Right up on top of a rock hill there overlooking the locks.
Okay.
Yeah, across from the Turtle Bar or whatever. You'll know that.
I didn't know you knew me.
Does anyone have any questions for Fenian Brotherhood or us?
No, they didn't, but there was a couple of local companies here that were ready to go. The communication wasn't great back then. Even my dad told me his great-grandfather met in Cranbrook, Ontario, about 2 days after the battle because they didn't even know it was over yet. But they were all ready to go and fight if they could, and by the time they got ready, they said, no, we don't need you right now. We'll come back later. But the threat went on for about 5 years.
At the Battle of Ridgeway, when the Fenians won that battle, because they were dealing with local forces that were unprepared for them, they were forced to retreat because there was about 10,000 troops from all over Upper and Lower Canada that were then moving down to show them how welcome Americans are when it comes to invading the United States.
What goes around comes around.
Eccles Hill at the end of the Fenian Raids era, they got their act together. They got themselves shiny new uniforms with Irish Republican Army buttons, and they had shiny new rifles supplied by a British supplier who couldn't sell them anywhere else. And they were also, all those American Civil War veterans were gone. They were disillusioned. They thought this was a waste of time at that point, so they had young, enthusiastic, angry young men as usual, all signing on, and then they had no idea. So at Eccles Hill, they were up against local militia that had trained to sharpshooter standards. They had single shot rifles, and then of course increasing numbers of Canadian soldiers, since Canada existed as a country at that stage. And they were expecting 5,000 men. They had 800. 200 marched across into Canada. straight into an ambush. Since the Fenians, all the way through, had been overrun with informers, foreign agents from Canada, United States, Great Britain, everyone had a relatively rough idea of what they were doing. Their quartermaster was a double agent who had been literally hiding their rifles in a barn. It's an amusing story. All good invasion plans that are based on a bar, something you came up with at the back of a tavern, is always what you should base Irish independence. Of course, our shore Fenian Brotherhood might have a different take on it.